I can really open this up, but I'm just delaying so people get to their seats. There. Now I know why people complain about the lights. Yeah. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay.
I think so.
I think so. There's a...
It's Marshall, right?
No, it's John. In fact, I'm John Williams. I'm the interim president of Principia College, but more importantly, I'm part of the political science and mass communication departments. And so I'm the guy that they sort of said, well, when I became interim president, it was the guy who was supposed to be on sabbatical, and so he's on vacation, and it's half pay. And so in this case, it is, there's a nice intersection here between politics and mass communication. Do welcome to our Monitor Night Live evening. This is the, do we have it, does it say in the program? The 19th. It's got to be more than that. I've been here longer than that, but so it's at least the 19th. Again, it skipped some years. So it's been coming here for about 57 years. And Marshall Ingerson, who is our chief executive, was at every one of them. And don't mess with a guy with a microphone. That is the result of the change in the nature of media, because it used to be don't mess with someone who bought ink by the barrel. And now that we've gone electronic, don't mess with anyone that has their own generators so your electronics never go down. I'm supposed to give several announcements. The most important one for many of you is that after this is over, there is food. A dessert reception will be following in Leonard Hall, and a chance to meet our speakers. If you already haven't, many of you in class have met them. And there is a table for those thinking about internships at the Monitor. Kendra, are you, there you are. Would you stand up? Kendra Nordine Bieto is the internship coordinator for the Christian Science Monitor, along with a lot of other things. She loves food and writes about cooking a little bit. So that'll be available. There was a contest, a Instagram Monitor trivia contest. There are 7 winners out there, and you know who you are. I don't, but you do. So I can't reveal you to others. But you have your awards, or your rewards waiting for you, which include Principia pilot mugs and subscriptions to the Christian Science Monitor. And if you're not here, since I don't know who you are, I can't track you down, and you will not get those. I love accountability, which is one of the things we may talk about this evening, whether the media, in their role as spotlight, newspapers and journalists, hold the political system accountable, or maybe these days, the political system and the readers hold you all accountable, among those things. After we have some discussion up here, we will have questions from the audience. There will be 2 microphones placed on either aisle. Claire Giamani says that she will get a promotion if there were more than 10 people in each line. And I said, why does that matter? And she says, not only because this is being broadcast live on Principia Internet Radio, which I'm trying to be polite as I speak, because of that, I also have to behave myself because we are live streaming it. So those of you with political signs, when you raise them, make sure they're facing the cameras, because otherwise the rest of the world that is watching us will have the blank side of your signs. And you're sort of going, oh, you mean signs at rallies and press conferences are pre-planned? Yeah, some of them are. So I have gone through food, winners, microphones, and look good on television. And that brings us to the substance of this. We have with us the editor of the Christian Science Monitor, Mark Sappenfield. Wave so everyone knows. All of those with programs, raise your hand. Outstanding. We are hoping that you know how to read. So we'll make this quick. Story Hinckley is a political reporter with the Monitor, and she's based in Washington, D.C. and she's been racking up the frequent flyer miles. Scott Peterson probably has more frequent flyer miles than the rest of us together. Based in London right now, he is the Middle East correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. I've been told by past journalists, and I don't think Marshall, our chief executive officer, who was editor of the Monitor, has ever admitted this to me, but at least many of the reporters have, and they have stated that the Monitor is an editor's newspaper. And that means that editors control. Yvonne Zipp is one of those editors. And she's currently responsible for the daily edition of the Monitor. So I'm going to leave all the other details for the readers in the audience to look at as we dive into this. One of the instructions that Claire Germani, who is the teacher in the journalism program who put this together, Claire, raise your hand. We want to give you some thank you for putting this all together. She wanted each of the four to share a story or stories that come out of their experiences as journalists, in part because one of the trends in engaging readers is storytelling, and that's not necessarily a negative. It's a way of connecting with readers, and as you'll find, it's a way that journalists connect with their subjects and story. And since I said the word story, what is the term for a person's name who is also your job?
That segue.
That was from dinner.
Oh.
No, you're not supposed to tell how I get my segues. I'm supposed to look like cool.
You've passed.
Yeah, okay, that's right, all right.
It's an aptronym.
An atronym.
Aptronym.
Aptronym with a P, aptronym.
Well, A before the P.
I know. I canoe that. Or is it canoe that? Story. You've got stories. And I'm not sure it's going to be, what do you have for nutrition on the campaign trail?
Curly fries.
And I thought it was peanut M&Ms.
Oh.
That story.
Your segues are really great, yes. Yes, so I just came here from 2 weeks in Iowa, where I've been covering the caucus that everyone knows just, went off without a hitch. And one story that I reported there, it really also illustrates how great it is, not to be a plug for the Monitor, but that I get to spend so much time on the ground, really meeting people and talking to them and hearing their stories, because it was on a previous trip to Iowa a couple months ago that I was interviewing this woman, Kathy, at her house about this story I was working on, about how we've known for a long time that Sanders has a lot of young fans, but Mayor Pete, the youngest candidate in the race, has a lot of fans who are grandparents. And so I was talking to her. She was like, "Did you just pick me because I'm old?" No, Kathy. But so Kathy and I got to talking, and she has been saying in conversation how much she'd just been gushing about this young field organizer named Alex. And on campaigns, field organizers do everything from knocking doors to making sure that people know how to vote, where to vote. And so the more research and reading I did, that seemed like a great story idea. And because it really seemed, the more people I talked to, that within these campaigns, these little communities form and these relationships form. And so when I was in Iowa, as soon as I got there 2 weeks ago, I reported this story that the Monitor published last week that is about these campaign communities and about how these Iowans, many of whom are old and white and live in rural areas, become best friends with these young campaign workers who are young, most of the time from the coast, often really diverse, and these people don't have a lot in common except for the fact that they love this one candidate and they want him or her to have the White House. And that meant that I was spending time with these Bev and Chris, and they were giving each other a hard time, and Bev was yelling at Chris to come feed himself, and he was giving her a hard time like he was his mom. But to answer your peanut M&M segue, another point is that part of building these relationships and being a reporter, and just, which a lot of times means just making friends everywhere you go. Kathy had known that I was going to be at this rally in North Liberty, Iowa for Pete Buttigieg. And so I see this woman throwing elbows through the crowd to get to me, and it's Kathy, and she had brought me, hoping that I was going to be there, a pin that said, I'm a journalist, and did I interview you 4 years ago? Because every 4 years I was just flooded with journalists, and a huge Ziploc baggie of peanut M&Ms, and it said caucus vitamins. So the next day I emailed her and I said, Kathy, that Ziploc is already half empty. But so that's just an example of the great personal relationships along with sources that you make on the road.
And so have you ever had an experience of interviewing someone again?
Like for a second time?
Uh-huh.
Is this a segue that I'm supposed
It is a segue to your next story.
He knows the answer.
Oh.
I know the answer. Yes.
So
Within 2 days.
yes.
She didn't recognize him.
Okay, yes.
That story.
Yes. Oh, yes. There's so many potentials with your segue. I never there's.
We'll get to all your Magna friends.
Okay. Yes. So when you're on the ground in Iowa ahead of the caucus, there was one day that I realized within 36 hours I'd seen 4 different candidates in 4 different cities at 4 different rallies, and it's a lot of work. It's obviously I love it, but I was at a event for Joe Biden, and I get there early to interview everyone in line to see, why do you like this candidate? What do you think he'll bring to the White House? And I'm going up and down the line, and hello, my name is Story Hinckley. I'm a reporter with the Christian Science Monitor, kind of giving my spiel. And I guess I hadn't really looked at him yet, and I look up and he's just smiling at me. It's like, yes, sir? He's like, you talked to me 2 nights ago at the event for Tom Steyer. It's like, you got me, but I'd love to know your thoughts on Biden also. So.
Did he appear in both stories?
No, that would not be fair. That would seem
Iowa,
like I talked to one
Tom,
Iowan,
yes.
yeah.
At every rally.
Yeah.
At every rally. That would be an interesting story, maybe. What one Tom thinks at every single rally.
There we go. Well, the other one that's more fascinating is you call it camping out?
I call it camping out because it pretty much was camping out. I'd been to a bunch of Trump's MAGA rallies, Make America Great Again rallies, and I had told our political editor that the people who get there really early, there's this interesting culture around the rallies that it's more than just a political event. It is a cultural, social event, and I asked if we could do a story on that and explore that a little bit more. So the Monitor, being such a great paper and wanting to know these human stories, sent me to Minneapolis, and I went to the stadium where Trump was supposed to speak about 3 days in advance, just to get a lay of the land, not really expecting. And there was already some people in line, and so I spent 3 days with them. I did not sleep on the sidewalk with them. I went to my hotel room, but I re-met them at 6:30 in the morning with coffee, and then went back. So, and that was a really powerful story for me to report, because I really got to know these people, because my only job was to get to know them for 3 days, and it really reminds you that on both sides of the political spectrum that people just want to be heard, and these people had felt really isolated and shunned for a long time by a lot of people, and now they felt like they had a community and a club. And yes, that club stands for different things to different people, and sometimes not so very nice things, but they had met friends from across the country who they felt like they knew. And so it was a really great example of community, I think.
I'm going to use this to get you off the hook, and I'm going to segue to Scott. And would you start with your story of the Kurds and that being a community?
Intriguing community it was. And actually, let me first say in preface that I'm kind of surprised that I'm on the panel at all,
considering that I'm mostly doing my work off in far-flung regions in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and you might wonder how presidential politics impacts those places. I am here actually because going back to that idea of community, throughout my career, it's been very obvious in all these different places how a president impacts, even on a granular level, the places that you go to and the people that you see, and even just the least expected person who would be following your politics. And the example that you're speaking about is in 1991, during the Kurdish uprising in northern Iraq. There was a very large community of Kurds who had risen up against Saddam Hussein. They'd felt that they'd had a promise from President George Bush, the senior, that he would support them if they rose up. And of course, that support never materialized. And what happened instead was and I was there when Iraqi forces, Saddam Hussein's forces, started to fight back against these Kurds. So he was sending helicopters that were flying over our positions, rocketing different Kurdish attacks. The Kurds had moved as far as they could go. The helicopters are flying, and then the tanks came over the horizon. They're firing their tank shells at our positions. We're quickly retreating, but not just the handful of journalists who were there, including me, but also we had the entire Kurdish front line starts running off, and then all of the civilians behind them. So we ended up walking over the hills and the mountains into Turkey and into Iran with 1 million Kurds who fled. And all the while, there were American planes flying very, very high up, I mean, really high altitudes. But what the Kurds were saying was, "Where's Bush? Where's Bush?" This is probably the only 2 words they knew in English, but it was questioning me as an American reporter, where is this president who said that he would help us? And these are people who had nothing, living in one of the remotest places you can imagine, but were being affected right then by those politics. And of course, that was just one example, but if you follow every presidency...
The American planes didn't do anything to protect the Kurds.
Precisely, and the Kurds were expecting that to be the case. They were expecting that there would be some kind of support. It would have been very easy, in fact, to have stopped Saddam's helicopters. It would have been very easy to knock out a few of those tanks and prevent that offensive from going and allow the Kurdish uprising to actually make some progress. At the same time, of course, there was an uprising happening in the south as well with the Shiites.
Now, would you follow through the line of American presidents?
So, I mean, that's the one that George Bush Sr. that really felt that, but of course we also felt his operations in Somalia, which were kind of the first post-Cold War, kinder and gentler operation, which also fell apart in the Black Hawk Down incident especially. That's what symbolizes it most. President Clinton had his share of events, including the genocide in Rwanda, which I covered in detail in 1994, and was surprised to see just last week at a gallery in London where there's an artist who's done an exhibit showing all of the, trying to somehow quantify the 800,000 lives that were lost in the space of 100 days, which is unprecedented in modern history in terms of a death toll. And there was a video that included a clip from Bill Clinton, who had gone to Rwanda and basically issued his mea culpa. And he just said, this is a direct quote, he said, there were people like me who were sitting in our offices day after day who had no idea how quickly you were engulfed by this terror. So he himself, who could have acted, and his administration could have acted to do something, and hadn't done it. George Bush the Jr., of course, we have the Iraq War, we have the Afghan War. These wars I cover frequently, and they are still going on now after 18 years. We're still embroiled in these wars, and there's lots to be said among those who fought them, among those who suffered from them, among those who ordered them. This is an endless story and now part of our history as well. And ask the Iraqis who've been affected. Ask the Afghans who have been affected by those wars, and you will get a sense, and even on the smallest level, and an endless number of stories on that. Barack Obama. Syria happened under his watch. I was in Aleppo in northern Syria. I was in a little enclave with a rebel group, and these guys were in the process of being overrun by Bashar al-Assad's forces. And it was extraordinary to hear them say, as they were in the process of being overrun, we have been betrayed by Barack Obama because he did not send the weapons. He did not send the things that he said. He said, go ahead, this president cannot stand, and we can do something about it. And nothing happened as far as these guys were actually concerned. And then the day that President Trump was elected, I received a message from one of my Iranian researchers, actually, and of course the Iranians had just gone through 8 years with a populist and quite a hardline president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was very divisive to Iran and Iranian society. And literally his first words, and this is the first thing, I was in Baghdad at the time, he sends a text message saying, so now you know what it feels like to have a moron elected as a president. So that's what he said, but the aftermath of that election, we feel it out there every single day because people come up and are constantly, not only have we had the United States pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, not only have we had the Paris climate withdrawal from the climate treaty, but there have been so many things, and I can't count how many times people have come up to me and just said, how is it this is happening in your country? I mean, they're asking for enlightenment as if I know precisely how it happens. That's why I'm looking forward to hearing much more about that from my fellow panelists. So I can help explain to all these people who wonder how this has happened. Exactly.
Well, I'm going to bring this right to this campaign, and that, does it benefit a president to assassinate a foreign general?
That is a very good question. And it's one that I don't think we know the answer to yet. And the reason is because, so of course, you're speaking about the killing in the first days of January of General Qasem Soleimani. So he was the Iranian commander of the Quds Force, Revolutionary Guard Quds Force, who has been most responsible, the architect, you could say, of extending Iran's influence through the Middle East by creating, marshaling these like Shiite militia proxies. So he's got like Iraqi Shiite fighters mostly fighting ISIS, Islamic State fighting guys in Syria. He's even marshaled units from Pakistan, from Afghanistan to fight in these other fights. Remarkable, considering how few resources Iran has, that he's been able to do this. So he was the man who made that happen. And President Trump ordered his assassination in the first couple days of this year. And this would be akin to, actually an American diplomat emailed me and said, this is akin to like killing David Petraeus, Vice President Mike Pence, and like the CIA, chief all in one blow. This is what it meant to the Iranians. I mean, you may have never heard of General Qasem Soleimani, but for the Iranians and for his role in these things, I mean, you may as well have taken out the deputy of the supreme leader. It was huge. So what that means is, to answer your question, is we don't actually know the full fallout from this, which is probably going to take not just months or even years, but possibly decades in terms of the kind of revenge. And a lot of this stuff, we're not even going to know where it's come from. Things are going to happen that are going to make Americans suffer, that are going to make Americans bleed, probably not civilians, but they'll be mostly targeted at military forces. And we have 60,000 American troops basically encircling Iran at the moment. So, but initially there was this first strike. The Iranians, shot back with a bunch of ballistic cruise missiles against one of our main bases in Iraq. It's an Iraqi base, but where Americans were. 50 of them were quite severely wounded with concussion and other things. But that's just, be sure, that's just a start. And part of it is because of the way that this took place, the fact that the president owned it immediately and then in the Iranian eyes boasted about having taken him out. Of course it's a gamble. But I think, and some people argue that well, look at that, he's gotten away with taking out this clearly evil man, that's their argument, without much blowback. But I think that this blowback could go for quite some time and in ways that we can't imagine yet, because Iran has a lot of asymmetric capabilities.
Now, you all know that I do things for segue purposes. I use the word assassination. And some of you should be going, wait a minute, that's a loaded word. Yes, it is. But I'm going to use it for the segue here to Yvonne, and that is, another word could be justifiable killing, since he was the leader, conceivably, of operations that were underway, and that he was a legitimate legal target under law of war. Those two words I'm going to use as the basis of segue. And Yvonne, would you talk about your brother and your father and tell us the stories?
I can't believe I have to go after him.
No.
So, You said my brother, my dad, and what was the?
And their stories and how they reflect within a family this division.
Absolutely. So my dad is a military veteran. He lives in North Carolina. He's a big supporter of President Trump. My brother is a military veteran who lives in North Carolina, and he is not a supporter of President Trump. So in our own family, I do what I do every day. We have the divide that the country is experiencing. And what's been so interesting is, they read the Monitor differently. My brother is an old-fashioned print guy. He gets the weekly. He loves the Monitor. He's really grateful for it. My dad travels a lot, and so he gets the daily. He loves the Monitor. He's really grateful for it. And in our own family, we've sort of come to just kind of really relied hard on unconditional love and knowing that, I love both of them dearly, and that doesn't change. And politics and whoever is president cannot change our relationship.
Now, as editor, you're responsible for reporters in the field, and you had one reporter interview Stephen King.
Yes.
Now, and you'll need to explain who that is for people that don't know Iowa politics or
Not
maybe
the
do.
horror writer. He lives in Maine. So Steve King is a representative of Iowa. He has strongly, I would say, anti-immigrant views. And about a year ago, you all may remember, there was a big blow-up when the New York Times published an interview with him in which he sort of was saying, well, what's wrong with the term white nationalism? Why is that not okay? And we had separately sent our reporter, Jessica Mendoza, to Iowa before this had happened, on a completely different story that was all about internet for rural areas, okay? But she's there, so let's pick up some stories. And so our politics editor said, well, this is Steve King's district. Please, interview everybody. He had won re-election by the sort of narrowest margin of his career. And so she went around and she was interviewing pastors and business owners and some Latino folks who had moved to the district. And she gets her story. She comes back to Congress and has an interview with Representative King. And we had done all of this, and then all of a sudden this New York Times story comes out, and everything is huge. So we get our story out there, and the reaction from King's camp was not what you would expect. He was grateful. He felt he was fairly reflected. He felt that the article was quoted him accurately, represented his district fairly. I should say that, Jess is from the Philippines. So this is a young immigrant woman who is bringing so much empathy and so much grace to her work. And, that's, I think, speaks to what the Monitor tries to bring. We always want to see the humanity in everybody. We always want to extend the dignity and grace that we would want extended to ourselves. So that's something we try to do. We don't do it perfectly. We are a deadline operation. That daily's got to go out every day. But that is the goal that we are striving for.
Okay. Mark, you know what we're going to talk about. I'm not quite sure I'm going to do the segue.
Come on, that's your thing.
That's my thing. Okay.
Stumped you.
He stumped me because I don't know which of my three things I would do. Do I want to talk about Yale University,
Yeah.
and the lab there?
Right.
But I thought the story that you have about the founder of, and it's called the Human
Human Nature Lab.
Nature Lab, which is an interdisciplinary collection of many, many disciplines studying human nature. But in his writings, he came to a conclusion of biology.
Yes.
And that environment, the process of evolution invariably leads to
Goodness.
goodness.
Yes.
We've got academics working in a major organization in Yale who say their understanding of evolution is the evolutionary process leads to goodness. And that attracted you to go down and talk with them.
Yeah.
And what were some of the things you were discovering that relate
Yeah.
to this?
I've just found since we've kind of gotten into the space we are politically in this country, I've really looked for people who are trying to see through this and are trying to say, what are the ways forward? And just exactly what everyone's been talking about, what Yvonne has been talking about, is how is it that we can kind of see through these things to a deeper humanity and begin to knit together that common purpose that we know is really essential for countries to work well. So this person, I read his book, and you just quoted it. His name is Nicholas Christakis. He's a professor at Yale, and he runs this human nature lab, which is fascinating because it really is, in a completely biological level, trying to figure out how humans are hardwired. To the point that one of the things that they were doing is they were trying to figure out if friends give off a certain smell. Because what the different research has found that actually partisans give off smells that those partisans like. There was one thing where they found that they gave some person the smell of someone who was of a similar party, and this person was like, that is the most bewitching scent I have ever smelled. That was actually part of the study.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt here.
Yes.
Because in Jersey County, the Democrats at their get-togethers have beer, fried catfish, and go out shooting shotguns.
Bewitching.
Bewitching. The Republicans have wine and roast beef. Not bewitching?
Well, it's bewitching to Republicans.
There we go.
But this is what, I mean, that's the detail that they're going into. They're really trying to deconstruct why it is that we act the way they act. And he has really focused a lot on evolutionary biology. And I was just so fascinated. He wrote this book called Blueprint, and the final line of it is, which you just quoted, is he quotes and says, the evolutionary arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward goodness. And I wanted to talk with him because that's a very, especially at this time, that's not a conclusion you'd think that people would come to. But it's the conclusion that the monitor thinks that is natural to the world, that is where we need to go, that if going in the other direction doesn't do us any good. And so I wanted to kind of acquaint monitor readers with his thinking and talk about that a little bit. And ultimately, we kind of went into his office. He took me through the organization and all the wonderful things that it did. But I kind of pushed him on this question. I'm like, how is it that we as humans, from his perspective, how do we overcome this? And what he said I thought was really fascinating because it puts into practice what Yvonne was talking about. Is he said, basically you have two choices. Is you can go up a level or you can go down a level. And what he meant by that is you could go up a level and talk about our universal humanity. Because human beings are hardwired to understand that we are of one. That you are a human and I am a human, and that we can find that commonness that goes through us and build off that. It's finding those things that we respect about each other. It's looking for the good in each other and finding that and building from that. Or you can go down a level to a literal individual reaction. And he said, it's hardwired in us to be able to make friends. That's not hardwired in every creature, he says, but it's hardwired into humans. And what we can do is you can look into someone's eyes and you can say, I know you have value. And you can start there. And I mean, that's to me fundamentally what Jessica was doing, is she might not have agreed with anything this other person said, but she looked at him as a human and she said, I'm going to see you as a human and I'm going to be respectful and I'm going to do my job in a way that gives me credit as a journalist, but also doesn't, take whatever opinions I have and use my journalism as a way to twist that into the story. I'm going to see you and I'm going to let people see you as you see yourself. And that way, that's the purest picture of it. And of course, monitor readers can come to whatever decision they want, but he clearly felt like he had been represented well. And I think that's a sense of, we get to the truest sense of one another when we want to warp people into kind of fitting the stereotypes, and you've talked a lot about this story, is how we see stereotypes instead of seeing people. Yeah. When we see stereotypes, that's not good journalism. Because what you're doing is then you're giving people a picture of your stereotype. And what's the point of that? What you want to do is you want to give people a sense of who these people are and what motivates them. And that gives them a picture, and that gives people an ability to see the world as it is and to actually wrestle with that, because it's very hard these days. but also to begin to actually look at what are the ways forward. Because if we don't see each other correctly, there's no way we're going to be able to find those common ways forward.
Okay. I do have another question for you, but this is the perfect time that if you do have questions, you may want to start lining up, and I'll go back and forth between the mics. So to give you time to start getting up, you and I had a conversation at dinner about the human mind going for being very dualistic. It's got to be binary.
Yes.
Would you talk a little bit about your thinking on that?
I promised I wouldn't use that word, so I'm going to have to think
Binary?
about it.
Oh,
Yes.
you can't do. Oh,
It's too.
I got my revenge.
Yes. I think one of what we were talking about is that I think the lesson that has been the deepest lesson to me in my time as the Monitor editor, and this is informed by my metaphysics and how I think about this, is that the human mind, and I think Nicholas Christakis would agree with this, is naturally kind of predispositioned to try and turn things into a this or a that, into the binary, into two things. It's like I have to choose a 1 or a 0. And we want to then tribalize around that. We want to choose one, okay, what identifies me is this, and then I'm going to start making my identity around that. And that's something that he would say that one of the things that we're struggling against with human nature is that he would say it points back to who we were, thousands of years ago and how we survived and these sorts of things. But it's not relevant to today. It's not the way that we as a society should organize because it's not helpful today. And what I've found is that the answer is almost never this or that. It's both. Is that there is, and again, this is where some metaphysics comes into it, but God is one. And we were talking about this, is one of the things that occurred to me is the initial act of biological existence is the division of the cell. The idea that 1 has to become 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then all of those things. But kind of getting back to that core understanding that we have of truth in a deeper sense, is that we need to overcome this sense that we are being forced to choose, tree of good and evil. First Genesis is about there is one creation, and it is good. Second Genesis is about there's these two things, and you got to choose. It's either this or that.
Or you're going to heaven or hell.
Right. All of these things, all of these ways of looking at this or that. And whether it is Republican, Democrat, whether it is capitalism, socialism, whether it is individualism, individual liberty, or kind of communal government seen as, like small government, big government. Kind of taking these things and reducing them down to this kind of either or both takes out the nuance and also takes out the good. Because there's inevitably good on both sides. And when we concrete ourselves into taking a side, we miss the opportunity to see the good in the other side and to knit those together into a common narrative, which is where the power actually comes from. So that was just something that's
what we were thinking about. And we are having people starting to line up. And this is really tough because if I follow his lesson, I've got to have you both ask your questions at the same time. But since I'm standing on this side of the room, I want to be fair, and I'm going to let this side start first.
He was there first, though.
Oh, he was?
Yeah.
That is one. That is one. That is so cool. And that wasn't planned at all. High five, fist bump. Sir.
Thank you guys for coming out and talking for us. I've got a question for really anyone. I'm inspired by something that you were just talking about, Mark. Is there truth or just opinion is what the topic we're here to think about and hear you guys talk about. And I'm wondering what not what the difference, maybe what the relationship is between metaphysical truth and journalistic truth. And maybe how that relates to this question of is there truth?
That's you.
We'll leave that to the top man.
That's fair. I've thought a lot about this, but I mean, that doesn't mean that I'd be interested in your thoughts too. That didn't come out right. You understand the spirit, not the letter, right?
Is it a deadline or a deadline?
You went there, so I'm going to go there. Mrs. Eddy founded the Monitor to spread undivided the science that operates unspent. That is my answer to your question. What do I mean by that? I mean by that, and this is why I'm so interested in people like Professor Christakis and others, and why I am going out and finding those people. Just a small digression. In the hotel that I'm staying in, there's something on the wall, and it's all these things that's like seek truth, act kindly, do justly. And I don't think that person is a Christian Scientist. I don't know what they are, but when you reduce things down to their essence, there is a core that all humanity agrees on and sees as progressive. And not progressive in the kind of left-right sense, but as helping human progress. You can distill those things down into qualities that all of humanity, no matter where you are, universally says this is a positive thing. And just some people have said it. One is responsibility, compassion, respect, honesty, fairness. These things are universal. And to me, they speak to what Mrs. Eddy was saying, is that fundamentally the Monitor is about looking at where those things are operating and chronicling that. And to me, that is where there is no distinction between divine truth and journalistic truth. And I think, to me, the distinction of the Monitor, the reason the Monitor exists is because we understand that, is that the way the world moves forward is by the expansion of divine qualities. You don't need to see it that way. Nicholas Gersakis doesn't see it that way. That's fine. But he sees the world moving towards goodness because he sees these qualities growing. And the Monitor's role as a newspaper is to help grow those, help the support of those. Not by any policy, not by telling you what to think on a left-right axis, but by saying we should all want these things. And it's a wrestle. I mean, when you ask what's fairness, and you're talking about fairness on an issue that's very, very pointed, you might have two different opinions of what's fair. The important thing is to wrestle and to, again, the tendency is to say it needs to be this or this. And I'm thinking of something like LGBT rights and religious freedoms. Those two things present themselves as being a this or that. But I just contend that it doesn't need to be that way. I contend that there are ways forward that allow for the expansion of dignity, the expansion of liberty, the expansion of justice for all. Because I believe that's what Mrs. Eddy was telling me is true, that there is not one that is left out. And I think we might not see the path yet, we might not know how that happens, but the Monitor has the faith to recognize that that's where we're heading, and we need to go find where thought is moving in those directions so that we can hold that up and say this can happen. Again, not for any policy, but for those qualities to be expressed. So that's how I would answer it, and that's how I see those two things as being one. And I don't see that as being bad journalism, I actually see it as the most helpful journalism that can be done, because it sees the world as it is and it helps it move forward.
I'm going to ask your indulgence. Just go ahead.
Yes, please.
Just one thing as an addendum, I think that this whole concept distills beautifully in just the few words that actually are the motto of this newspaper: to injure no man, but to bless and to bless all mankind. This is, for a journalist, this is like the most noble aspiration that you can have. I mean, really. And it's something that when we look at how other news organizations and media, look at the news and how they cope with it, I just think that this distills those concepts down of trying to do good, of chronicling those aspects that are universal and that are remarkable without also doing harm is
I want to ask you real quick,
ideal.
and that is, from your perspective, you're covering stories that either in politics, we've got a world of confusion, even the Democratic Party of Iowa hasn't quite figured things out, or you're in war zones. Can you spot a quick example in which, to your utter surprise, these qualities just blossom like a flower?
So I've always been amazed in Baghdad over the last 20 years that I've been reporting about a single family that is it's a widow, she has 8 children, and I have been reporting on them since Saddam Hussein's time. And the first day I met them, we sat on the floor because they had just sold the couch to pay school fees for one of the daughters. Now that daughter has since gone on to actually end up going to the American University of Soleimani in northern Iraq. She's now actually in Ohio on a Fulbright, of all things. And part of that is because somebody read the story that I wrote about the grades that she got when she finally graduated years later and said, wow, this is someone who could actually fit in here, and got her onto that program. I mean, that's the positive side. But this family also has had some very negative and dark aspects, all of which have been exemplified in the 20 stories that I've written about them over these years. One of the sons was picked up in a joint U.S. Iraqi patrol, was held in prison and tortured for 2 or 3 years, bankrupting the family, which already had nothing. I mean, dirt poor. Ended up owing tens of thousands of dollars in bribes that they'd paid to various judges and, and police officials and others who all said that they'd be able to do something, none of which they could do. And he's, of course, scarred for life. Marriages coming together, marriages falling apart, all of these things that we've chronicled. And even in the worst times that it was to be a Western journalist in Iraq. And remember, we had our own Jill Carroll kidnapped in 2006. She was held by Al-Qaeda for 83 days. Even in those days, trying to get to see this family who lived in a place called Karada, it's a district in Iraq that is regularly subject to suicide bombs and everything else. And because of that, all the streets were blocked off for blocks and blocks around their house by concrete barriers, so you couldn't actually drive there. So to visit this family during those days, I would literally have to dress up. Now, of course, I will never look Iraqi, but there are things that you can do that on first glance are not going to raise people's suspicion, especially if you're kind of flying by, of course, that have a beard, and just literally the way you wear, your Shiite rings, the way you wear your belt, the way you have, your sunglasses, and especially the type of shirt that you wear. So coached this way, then I could actually walk to them, be there maybe for not even more than 20 or 30 minutes to catch up and do the latest news. But every single time that I saw them and I left, I had a sense of resilience that they had and of hope in a place that was hopeless. This is when tens of thousands of people in the course of this conflict are dying every day, and they're seeing it. It's right on their streets. That's exactly why why we're there and why we're reporting. But what surprised me every time was how invigorating it was. Their black humor, how they were coping, all their coping mechanisms, which are just incredible. And of course, they're not the only one. This one Iraqi family was such a perfect symbol and emblematic of all what this war meant and what Iraqis went through, both their suffering, but also their ability to triumph over these things. So there's an example of exactly that, and focusing on that family and having a newspaper that actually embraced telling that kind of story, not just on embeds in Fallujah or other things, all of which we did, but being able to tell that human story and how this war impacted them was, I think, the work of this newspaper.
Yeah, and I mean, Dad, you wondered why you were on this panel, but I mean, you have so many stories. I mean, another one is the Fallujah one where you talk to those people and how they've come. I mean, it's just over and over again, they just pour off the page in what you do.
Thank you. But it's out there. I mean, that's the thing. And we're looking for it. And we're finding it. So this isn't stuff that's like concocted. We're not, trying to, come up with some prism that doesn't exist. I mean, we're finding it. And that's, I mean, for me as a journalist, this is like the most motivating thing. Because you're out there telling those kind of stories that other people aren't seeing or finding. And it's, it's powerful.
Sir.
This is for whomever would like to answer it. A time you witnessed two people with extremely different, antagonistic perhaps viewpoints that connected in some emotional or poignant way. Does that make sense? Hopefully it happens. And
Yes.
if not, we'll move on.
I know it does. I mean, there's just, I feel like that's, in a way, my job to look for that. So I feel like I see so many examples of it. I mean, I have Iowa on the brain since I just came from there, and I don't know if this isn't as one of the most intense or prolonged interactions that I've been witness to, but, I was canvassing, which means just going around and knocking on doors with a campaign staff for Amy Klobuchar's campaign. And they knocked on the door, and a man answered, and he's an Iowan, he knew what they were there for. He said, "I'm a Republican, I support Trump, but you can go ahead, give me your pitch." And not a win for the Klobuchar campaign. They didn't get a new supporter out of him, but the women gave their spiel that they gave to everyone on the block. He listened, said, "Okay, have a nice night," shut the door. And that just happened all across Iowa. And it was just really encouraging to see people listening to each other in every sense of the word. But that's just a really small example.
Yeah. Yvonne, yeah.
I have a non-political one. Our New York correspondent, Harry Brunius, was researching why crime in New York City is so low. And so, he figures he's going to go and report. And so he attended a meeting where mothers who had lost children to violence were there. And he saw a moment that was just so profound and so haunting that it's resonated with us all. And I probably will ugly cry, so look away. But one of the women there, her son had driven the getaway car. He was not the shooter, but he had driven the getaway car for the murder of another mother. And they had this moment of profound grace and forgiveness where they embraced. And I don't know how you reached that level, but they did. And he was so moved by it that basically for the next month he did nothing but write that story, because he wanted to do it justice, because it was something so profound that it needed, you couldn't just toss that off. So if you look up our forgiveness cover story from I think 2018, that's one I can give you.
Sir, I'm going in order that I saw you show up.
Hi, my name's Christian, and I have a question for Yvonne. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yvonne, but yeah.
Yvonne? Okay. You were saying how your brother and your father have different political views. My father and I have also different political views. And I feel like that's a big thing in this country, that people who are very close to each other and associate with each other a lot are on different sides of the spectrum for politics. And from a journalistic point of view, anyone can really answer this, but just because I feel like we have a similar situation, I'm asking you. How do we work with that? Because I'm saying that, we have a lot of people that are on either side, and is it good to just not talk about it at all, or is a certain way, based on the experiences that y'all have had, to handle that and to have people grow closer, at least socially, if not accept each other's opinion?
Okay, sure. So I can tell you what we do in my family, and I'm not saying it's a perfect answer. And I also need to specify that I am not somebody whose safety is at risk. And if you are somebody whose safety is at risk, then you need to make the decisions you need to make for yourself. But I think if you're trying to talk to them to change their mind because they're wrong, you're probably not going to have a very good conversation. If you can try to just sort of ask, okay, well, why do you feel that way? What do you like? Can you tell me more about that? And you listen. It doesn't mean I fully expect that we will walk into this next election and my family will continue to not vote for the same people. But if you can understand why somebody feels the way they do, where they're coming from, and you see the underlying goodness of them, I think it's possible to at least have reasonable conversations. Again, they're probably not going to be fun. It's probably not going to be, yay, let's sit down to Thanksgiving and I'll talk about politics. But I think if that respect, that love, those family bonds, they matter. And trying to hang on to that, even though it really can get really hard.
And it's not quite the same situation.
Yeah.
I have uncles and aunts who would be on one side and sisters and mothers who are on the other side. And what I just try and say is that there is something that's between us that is more important than politics. You know, politics does not need to define our relationship. You can believe this, but who you are as an individual and what I see in you as an individual is not defined by your politics. It's defined by something much more than that. So that's, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in there, but it was just, that's how I've thought about it. Is I try to just say, I don't have to make our relationship about politics. I can disagree with you, but there are just things in this world that are much larger than politics. And again, I'm getting metaphysical here, but just my understanding of who you are is far greater than any political view you hold. And I can hold on to that no matter what comes out of your mouth. And not in a sense of then putting that to the side and, oh, I'm just, no, but I hope I'm seeing you as who you are, no matter what you say. And that's whether I agree with you or disagree with you, that's the thing we should be doing. And I just feel like this is a time when we can really test ourselves on that. And we're testing ourselves as a country on that. I mentioned, again, at dinner tonight, there's this wonderful quote by this author, Marilyn Robinson, who says, "Democracy forces us to think well of one another." And I think there's something very profound in that. And I think something very progressive in it, in that democracy forces us to work through our issues. And if we don't, obviously we don't have to agree with each other. That's not the point of democracy. The point of democracy is to have a situation where we can all find some larger sense of us. And that larger sense of us is not based on just our policy, but on how we view one another.
But at the same time, I also think that we need to talk about politics more. And I mean, you're taught as a kid, don't talk about politics at the dinner table, or you go to a party, don't talk about politics. But in a lot of ways, I think we are where we are right now as a country because we don't have political conversations with one another, or conversations about issues that have become political, when really I think what needs to be had is a lot of conversations with people who think really differently from us. Because if you go into it knowing that I'm not trying to change your mind, I just want to know why you think the way you do, a whole different thing comes out of it. And you realize that a lot of people right here and right here have the exact same goal. And you can debate the ways they want to go about it. Some, I'm talking to Front Row Joe at the MAGA rallies, who's in the front row for every single Trump rally, and versus Kathy, who is my friend who gave me M&Ms in Iowa. And, thinking about the things that they talk to me that are important to them are keeping their families safe, keeping their children healthy and happy, making sure that they have jobs so they can support themselves. And that leads them to have different politics, but that's the same thing that they're working from. And then, so, if you want to have a debate with someone about gun policy, maybe not trying to change their mind, but realize their end goal, whether they want to ban guns or buy more guns, is safety, and that's where we should start the conversation.
At the common cause.
Right.
Yeah. Sir.
Hi, your story about the reporter doing the article on Steve King and how she was presenting him as he was, not how she wanted him to be portrayed, made me think of Donald Trump. And I think we can all agree that in the media, Donald Trump has a pretty negative image. And I'm wondering how much, I wouldn't accuse the Monitor of this, but how much do you think the media has decided that they have it in for him and they want him to be presented in a negative light? Or how much is he just doing it by himself?
Well, which media? I guess would be my question.
The media in general. I don't know, pick any, I don't know, CNN. It just seems in general that he's presented negatively. And is he doing that by himself, or is it media that, like when he was talking a lot about fake news? Is media upset about that and they have it in for him, and do they want him presented in a negative light?
And I guess my question was slightly different.
Yeah.
It depends on which media you're looking at. So as we have sorted ourselves into political parties, we have also sorted ourselves into the type of media we are willing to consume. So I would imagine that if you watch Fox News, you are getting a very different impression of the president than if you are watching MSNBC. So that's the reason I asked that question, because the different sides of the political spectrum at this point have their own go-to public TV stations, publications, websites.
I think I get my news from different sources. It just seems, in general, he's presented negatively. And I'm just curious how you think, how much the media is crafting that image, or is Trump just doing the negative image all by himself?
Well, we're not a monolith. We're not, there isn't like a cabal of editors who get together and decide that this is the story today, or this is how it isn't. it isn't an organized, it's
a
not like,
monolith. I mean,
it's not a monolith. It isn't like there's a, so I can only speak to what we do, because those are the only editorial meetings I attend. Those are the only stories that I'm responsible for trying to present, and we try to approach the president as we do everybody, from a sense of fairness. Our Washington bureau chief is adamant about that. She takes that extraordinarily seriously.
Yeah, I guess it's not a very good question to ask the Monitor people, because
Well,
I don't think of the Monitor doing that.
Sure.
So I just wonder if you have a sense that that's going on.
One thing that I might say is that I mentioned this at a different time, but I've often felt like the Monitor, by trying to do what we're talking about here and actually see people, as we were talking about with the Steve King story, it feels to me like our feet are on two ice floes that are moving farther and farther apart, and we're just having to do splits more, because I feel like what's extraordinary about this time in American history is, if you read political scientists who are looking at this kind of in a neutral way, I think pretty much all of them would say we are more polarized now than at any point since the 1920s, or perhaps since the Civil War. And the rules governing modern journalism were created during the kind of the 40s, 50s, 60s, when society was certainly going through problems, but the whole thing was more centrist. You can look at how Congress acted and all these things that suggest that it was, people were more kind of all of a piece and kind of were more centrist. And so now we're in a moment where there are two camps. These are the most strident political camps, but the strident political camps are the people who drive the coverage in a lot of cases, because they're the people who consume the coverage. Where you have one camp who thinks that President Trump is actively on the path to destroying the country, and you have the other side who believes that President Trump is rescuing the country. Those are incredibly different standpoints. And for those who believe that he is destroying the country, they are now wrestling with this. I am supposed to be, according to the rules of this kind of centrist journalism that was done in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, I am supposed to be impartial. But at the same time, what am I supposed to do when I think someone is actively destroying my country? And I think the right side of the media went through some of this with President Obama and how they saw how he was approaching it. And so it's really straining the threads of what we have come to see journalism as, because these people feel like they are in a situation that journalism is trying to cope with the situation that it has not seen in its modern form. If you want to see how journalism was when we were that partisan, you can just go back and look at the newspapers, which each took a side, and they just kind of blared the position of that side. That's what's natural to that time, but we're not there yet, so you've kind of got this moment where we're struggling with this. And I feel like, to the point that Yvonne said, is that there are some media, and this is a lot of kind of the media that have some of the largest voices, who are struggling with this from that being concerned about President Trump. And there are some media who are very much supportive in President Trump and see him as again, something that is kind of bringing a renaissance to the United States. So in that monolithic point, I think that among the media that probably you're talking about, I think that there is that coming through that great fear and that sense of, what do? We need to be fair, but at the same time, what do we do if we think our country is being taken in a direction that we think is bad? So it's just, to me, it's really pulling apart at the fabric of what we've come to expect journalism to be, and how society evolves going forward will determine the form that journalism takes.
And how much do you think that is a reflection of the economic structure of media?
I think it's inevitable that if you're driven by a profit motive, you will do what your readers want you to do. And so if your readers are becoming more partisan, you will become more partisan to serve them.
Because you've got a guaranteed audience, and you know
you need someone to read your stuff.
Okay.
And if no one's in the middle, why would you be in the middle? You're someone without an audience.
So that's a third explanation, is that that scholars use, is this is a result of the economic structure, not that anyone's trying to follow either a value base, we want to be balanced, fair, and in the center, or we're naturally biased, But there's this third argument that it's a result of the way we fund our media based on getting subscribers or getting an audience for advertisers. Yeah. Let's see. Who? Great, we'll go over there. Yes, ma'am.
There's maybe a fourth.
Great.
Last night, I'm a praying person. Before I go to bed, I try to embrace the world and meet whatever is the most current prevailing issue. And of course, last night we had a pretty big political issue, didn't we? And as I thought about that, I was drawn to my computer. I was already in my pajamas. I was really ready to head for bed. I was drawn back to my office, to my computer. I opened it up and I clicked on one of the many things I subscribed to from the Monitor. I can't remember whether it was the political newsletter of the week or what, but it had the remarkable long article, lots of beautiful pictures, about a fourth possibility of why we feel so alienated from each other. And that was the role that Russia has played, and that dear Estonia, a little tiny country of 1.3 million, how they have learned to deal with Russia's meddling and divisive rhetoric that would cause occasionally a riot, where some minority group, in this case in Estonia, the Russian-speaking citizens, will get barraged with misleading input, and they'll riot. And Estonia has just astute Estonia, has astutely learned to immediately do a tremendous amount of detective work to find out what is the truth and to control the cybernet input. And the Monitor did this huge article, a Principia graduate wrote it, Krista Case Bryant. Did I get the last name right? She wasn't married when I knew her. And just imploring America to talk to Estonia about how to monitor this sort of divisive rhetoric that has very purposely driven whites from blacks with the targeting of misinformation, and of course Republicans and Democrats through the last several years. And Krista used the phrase dark arts, and that really got my attention. And I have been enjoying claiming that I will not be made to believe that the other is my enemy, that we share nothing in common, and that we might eventually fight with each other. And instead, I'm going, Mark your route, that there is a oneness here, that if we defend truth, we will come through this and be stronger because of it. But I just wanted to thank you. And I have kind of a question, which is, how did you write that article? It was sponsored by some fund. You got a grant or something. And how did you do that? And how did you let her write so much when she was in Iowa? How did that happen?
You probably know more about that than I do.
So, Krista was not in two places at once. She went to Estonia in the fall, but this was something that she's been very interested in, misinformation, the uses of it, and how one combats it. It's been something she's been pursuing for a long time. So the Solutions Journalism Network is somebody who likes the work we do, because we do a lot of solutions journalism. And so Krista applied for a grant so that she could go to Estonia, and so that we could send a photographer and do a cover story. And her part of that all happened before she went to Iowa. Poor Alfredo had to go to Estonia. Our photographer had to go to Estonia in January. Alone.
He ate a lot of good food, though, he said.
Yeah, but there was no daylight there.
Take all your photos between the hours of 1 and 3.
Yes. So that one was how that one came to be. But thank you. That was I'm delighted to hear you that spoke to you.
Yes, sir.
Hello, I'm Matthew.
Hi,
and so
no. You helped us out last year.
I did. And so my question is for Scott. I know you have covered a lot of conflict in the last 20 years or so, especially in the Middle East. And so how do you cope with that and kind of see the light, even though there's been so much tragedy in those situations? And what's a story that highlights that light within the darkness and the tragedy? So thank you.
This is a great question. Thank you very much. And actually, I think that the fact that my motive is so often to look for that light is one of the things that helps kind of shield me from what you actually see. I mean, I covered the genocide in Rwanda, and there was very, very little light there. And also tragedies like, for example, I don't know if you remember this incident in Beslan in southern Russia many years ago when Chechen separatists took over a school on the first day of school and basically, ended up killing 300 school kids. And I was based in Moscow in those days, and the Russians don't have much time for God since the Soviet era, and they don't have much time for anything except their family and their children. So to witness how they coped with that and dealt with it was something incredibly powerful, and for me also that was one of the few times that really also kind of crossed the line, because I have 4 children myself. So I really understood in the sense that when they were looking and identifying and doing all of that, I understood the emotive impact of what they were witnessing. So there really are a few moments of light or points of light that are going to come from an incident like that. But on this level, in this particular kind of humanitarian level, you can see the love and the devotion that these parents had as an example for, it's of a much wider variety throughout society. All it really helps you understand is actually the scale of their loss for themselves. But this is one thing that at least was displayed in the course of this on what otherwise is a completely grim event. But in terms of covering these things repeatedly, today I was in a classroom where we spoke a lot about a story that I wrote about Fallujah. I was in Fallujah in November 2004, embedded with the U.S. Marine Company, and I was with these guys for 30 days. And they, in this unit, they lost 1 in 5 guys, dead and wounded. I myself still have shrapnel in my arm from this event, and I got to know these guys really, really well. So even though their job was to go through and kill every single jihadist in that city, and believe me, they knocked down every single door, jumped through every single window, and blew open everything that was locked before them. I got to know them on a personal level, so that when I came back 10 years later and basically traveled around the States, tracking these guys down to see how they coped, I was able to tell their story anew with how they had gone from this pinnacle of a warfighter's experience. This is how they saw it. Because remember, Fallujah for the U.S. Marines was the biggest single Marine operation since the Vietnam War and since 1968. It was really a big deal for them. So for them to have actually, those who survived it, to get through it was a peak. And many of them, even at that time, were like, I'm sure I will do nothing remotely as important in my life ever again, because this is so important. So coming to them 10 years later and hearing their stories of, first, in most instances, their emotional suffering, because many of them just dropped, and they had issues with drinking and with drugs and with psychological issues and PTSD and all sorts of problems. But then watching them rebound and find their way, either through loved ones who were helping them out or who wouldn't give up on them, or for themselves finding even something as simple as a hobby, or falling in love with their dog, or falling in love with being on a sailboat and finding freedom that way. Those stories of renewal, especially so unexpected, because of course they're coming from this peak experience and then they just drop down. But watching them do that, I think, is something that really, it illustrates and also, again, helps shield you specifically from damage that can, I think, occur. A lot of my colleagues have been killed in doing what we do. A lot of them have suffered from all kinds of things. Some have committed suicide. And as have many Marines, obviously, and those who fought in these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think for me especially, the fact that I'm writing, I keep going to these places, but they're different places, and the circumstances are different, and the stories are different, and my motivation's the same. But the ability to get through it is something that, and write about it, is something that just kind of lets off steam along the way. My kids are amazing. My family is incredibly supportive. And all of those are things that allow that firewall in my mind to be separated from what I'm covering and how I'm covering it, and trying to do that as professionally and unemotive as possible, compared to the very fact that obviously I'm a human being and I'm affected by what I'm witnessing. So those are coping mechanisms. Everyone does it differently, and that's just how I churn through that stuff.
Sir, you're next.
Thank you. I'd like to just travel back to the main question that we have here tonight. Is there truth or just opinion when picking a president? So most of us in here, hopefully, are going to be traveling to the ballot this year. I feel like most people that I talked to before the event said, of course, it's your opinion. You know, you like this guy over this woman. That's your opinion. I'd like to hear an argument about why and how you can find the truth when going up to the ballot box, and how we can do it as well.
Oh, gosh.
I mean, I can start, but I think that would be a good question for everyone to weigh in on, or a couple people to weigh in on. What I would say is kind of what I've learned is, I mean, going a little bit different from the previous question about truth and metaphysical truth. If we're kind of taking this at the level of facts and like, what can I do? And again, building on what everyone else has said, is just because there are facts doesn't mean everyone is going to agree on them. And I think that's kind of the fundamental point, is that there is this kind of sense in society now that there aren't facts, and that everyone just kind of has their own, their opinions become their facts. But I do believe that, and this is something that demands a lot of us, but I do believe that where we are as a country right now is demanding more of us as citizens. You can find truth if you are persistent and if you are honest with yourself. And that means wrestling with one's own opinions. And you have to kind of follow that down and allow yourself to be driven by logic and by following what you know is good journalism. And that doesn't mean it's unbiased. Sometimes journalism is biased, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's being interpreted in a certain way, and sometimes you need to uninterpret that. There's this kind of sense of, oh, if they're biased, I just throw them out. That's not always a great way of doing things. I mean, people might, say the New York Times is on one side, but it's also a fantastically amazing paper that has the best reporting in the United States. That just because you might not agree with kind of where they come down on the spectrum doesn't mean they're not doing great work. You just need to be kind of conscious of where things might be coming from and kind of unravel that a little bit. But I do think that you can, if you're persistent and if you challenge yourself, you can come to a sense of what the facts are. And then ultimately about the opinion is that, and Yvonne, you've talked very eloquently about this, and we've written stories about the split screen nature of things. Just because you are seeing the same facts as someone doesn't mean that they are almost seeing the same thing. And you actually see this increasingly in the people who I've talked to in the scientific community, almost to the point of like visual relativism, where that something will happen and two people will see two completely different things. And we see that with witnesses in trials, is that people trying to say, oh, I saw this, it ends up there being a subjective nature to it. And that doesn't mean that there are no facts. It means you have to recognize that people see different things in those events. And the idea is not to try to convince them that they're wrong, but just to kind of dig through that to find what is the best, lowest kind of common denominator bedrock I can find in terms of agreeing on kind of what is true. And I do think you can do it, and I just do think we need to recognize that people are seeing those in such different ways and not being so shocked by that, but rather just trying to go down there and build from that outward in ways that you can kind of recognize there is something to build on, as opposed to dwelling on the ways that we see them differently. I don't know if you have talked about that really well before. I don't know if there's anything.
Well, so I miss Daniel Patrick Moynihan so much. He
that
said,
quote, yeah.
famously he said, "You are entitled to your opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts." There is demonstrable truth. Of course there is. There are things that have happened. There are things that have not happened. Some of it comes down to how much work you're willing to do, how willing you are to engage in the world. Are you very comfortable receiving your talking points from the, whatever side you're on, because those get disseminated very, very thoroughly and very, very quickly. I am amazed at how quickly I can call my dad, and he will absolutely, he is on message. Just, wow, that just happened. Or are you, so the Monitor issued a pamphlet in 1915 dealing with the subject of reader bias. I get asked a lot about media bias. I get asked a lot about our reporters and how are they sure they're fair. You're bringing your own experience and your own views and your own life to what you are reading, and so you are going to experience that differently. You are also bringing your own preconceived notions to what you think you're going to find based on whether or not you trust what you're reading. So I would just urge everybody to kind of do the hard work. Read something that makes you uncomfortable. Find something credible. Please, dear Lord, subscribe to anything. If you have a local paper left, please subscribe to it. Because when we had daily journalism and we had people, and in order to get a job and in order to be considered a upstanding citizen, you had to have read the daily paper. You had a common set of facts. Everybody in a town might have agreed that the editorial was stupid and, oh Lord, they misspelled my neighbor's name. But you had a common set of facts. And you still can have that. But it does mean being willing to read and to think about what you are consuming and what you are letting into your thought. In the way that a lot of people are extremely careful about what they eat. But then I find they are not careful about what they are imbibing mentally. I would just say that if you are looking for the truth, of course it exists, and of course you can find it. But you probably can't find it on Twitter in a meme.
Yes.
Oh. Hi. Hi, Mark.
Hi.
I spent about 4 hours in total with Mark today.
Yes.
So.
I followed you around the classes all day.
Yes, you did. So I was talking with Mark earlier, and I brought up this social experiment where they took two groups of boys to a summer camp, and they split them up evenly, randomly, and they never saw each other again until the end. And they had them doing fun activities, group bonding activities, and casually mentioning that the other group was like their rival. And then for the last X amount of days, they put them together in the middle of the forest and left them. And by the end of that time, because of this need to come together to find food and water and build shelters, they all forgot about the rivalry and they all became friends. And in that kind of extreme situation of needing each other's help to find common ground, it makes sense. How do we try to establish that kind of relationship with one another when we're so comfortable and so, we're well fed and we have a good house, but where is the space then to make it kind of a do or die situation before we actually get thrown into a third world war or the economy collapses, or like, what do we do before the bad thing happens to kind of try to communicate with each other on a level that, like you've touched on it, but communicate to each other on a level that just comes to the common ground, like you were saying. Like, it all comes down to, I want my kids to be healthy and happy, and et cetera. So, like, where does that common ground come in before it has to?
I think it starts with, like I said before, making yourself have political conversations and being okay with being uncomfortable and not expecting everyone to agree with you. And sometimes when I'm talking about my experiences and talking to people out in America, I feel the need to add so many caveats to what I'm saying, and it comes from a really good place, but I think we should challenge ourselves to, not get to the point where we're starving and need the food and water, but while we're comfortable, and we're having lunch, discuss policy. Yeah, I'm a nerd and I like talking about politics, but we need, especially our generation, needs to actually, and I don't think there's as much apathy out there, especially in our generation, as people like to say, but I think it's challenging ourselves to be civically engaged and interested in the world and interested in each other and interested in people who are so different from us and who make us really uncomfortable. So.
Let me add to that. Okay.
I have a
Go for it, please.
Yeah, I have a biblical answer for that one. Hey. I only got to spend 2 hours with her. But so I think, it says, who is my neighbor? Jesus says, who is my neighbor? I mean, that kind of really does boil down to it. And at the time that he was talking about Samaritans, they were regarded as evil and untouchable and anathema. So, whether you think of the Speaker of the House that way or the President of the United States that way, who is my neighbor? There's a study that came out this month that says Darwin might have gotten it wrong and that actually we are evolutionarily designed to cooperate. So it's not really survival of the fittest. It's if we all work together, we will survive. So we're going to have, I think, a science story about that in the next few days. It's an interesting way to think about it.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm going to build on what she asked and echo what Story has said. I'm a former high school social studies teacher, and I taught civics. And I argued that the main thing I need to teach is the art of deliberation and how to have difficult conversations. And that was what we did in my classes, because that's what was going to make us a successful democracy. I also use the Christian Science Monitor a lot to teach the topics of the day, so I want to thank you. But currently I tutor. And I work with a lot of young people. And what I'm learning from them is that old-fashioned media, the person who asked about media, is expanded. So I really appreciated when you said, what media? And I'm finding kids today, actually, they're on Facebook, and that's their media, and YouTube, and Twitter, and Instagram, and Reddit. And so what I'm curious about, and also then I've done a deep dive now into artificial intelligence and the ethics around artificial intelligence, and that I think has implications for what the person at Yale could be looking at, and I too am very interested in this writ large. But what I'm interested in is how this technological revolution, which is similar to what we had in the 40s and 50s, is impacting what you're doing in your daily job, and how we put out media today and consume media today around these worldwide contentious issues that affect everyone.
That's our subject for next year. that is a huge question.
Oh, no, you only have 2 minutes.
Yes.
In fact, we do, but go ahead.
I can give, as the resident millennial, I can give a millennial answer. Yes, I wish we all would read more, but I also think there's a value in meeting people, especially younger people, where they are. And so that's why I think, yes, we should be reading a newspaper and not getting our news off Twitter and Instagram. But if they're going to be going to Twitter and Instagram, let's put good stuff on Twitter and Instagram. Like I started reporting.
You're really good at that with your Instagram stuff.
Thanks, Mark.
So check out our Instagram feed. Actually, you should.
Stories by story.
And it shows you how you can do it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's difficult because I've had a long day of reporting and I've been on my feet talking to people and filing a story. But then when I'm laying in bed, I just upload the photo. And it's great because it's a piece of my story that doesn't get to be put into the story I can share. And most of my friends, they're honest with me, they don't read my stories, but they read my Instagram posts. And so, okay, I'd rather have them read that than nothing. So,
Or something else on Instagram.
or something else. And they know I'm being fair and charitable and trying to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. And so,
Well, that's what I'm saying. They've taught me. It's that I've opened my mind to all of this. I'm even open to video games now. One student wrote a paper on how video games build community, and it was compelling. But that's what I'm learning is how can we, I find there's a resistance amongst adults in terms of condoning these as sources of media. And so I'm wondering how you're bridging that divide and how it is affecting the work you do and the way you do it.
Go, Scott.
This is one reason why it's so important that journalists are there to distill all of this down, because there's so much more of what all of this is. It used to be that there would be a handful of stories coming out of a single place or a single city. I mean, these days, just the ocean of information is vast. It's peppered with all sorts of real live fake news. I mean, junk, real junk. So our job as journalists, and I think even more critical, especially for a newspaper like the Monitor, which prides itself in having this kind of special place in terms of the type of work we do and the type of motivations we have and the type of things that we're looking to report on, I think it's important that it's all the more important that we are there to distill from all of this stuff the things that are relevant, the things that matter, the things that are universal, that still exist but are so easily hidden and masked by the fact that there's just this vast Twitter sphere that's poisoned by all sorts of things. And I mean, Story's exactly right. You need to meet readers where they are. That doesn't detract at all from the actual job of finding and distilling to the right place the stories that matter, which is why journalists exist and why editors exist to shape those things. But we do it in a particular way. We need to be there as writers. If people aren't getting these things by email, it needs to be on Instagram or Twitter or whatever else, because that's how people are going to see it. And if that's the way to spread the word and get more eyes on your work, because so many people are looking for those nuggets of truth and shafts of light that come together in our reporting. And it is a remarkable thing, but people need to see it separated from all the other junk.
I've heard people's phones go off for 9 o'clock. So these will be the last two questions. Yes, sir.
Mine's real simple. Way more simple than most of these. Yvonne, you mentioned Stephen King has feelings about immigrants. Could the Monitor set an example for the rest of the media world and never, ever use that word immigrant again? If you're talking about illegal immigrants, say illegal immigrants. If you're talking about legal immigrants, say legal immigrants. And if you are talking about both of them, say both legal and illegal immigrants. Too often, people will say, oh, this person is treating these immigrants so terribly, but they're really talking about certain illegal immigrants. They use those words interchangeably when there's really a big, big difference. So I guess my question is, am I asking too much?
Well, we follow Associated Press style on that. So we actually use unauthorized immigrants.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying, no, but.
Just differentiate between legal and unauthorized or illegal or undocumented or.
Sure.
Don't call them all the same thing.
Well,
They're not.
We don't. If we know somebody's legal status, we specify. In this particular, there are some folks who feel like maybe we ought to put the brakes on all forms of immigration. So that's more, they're not necessarily differentiating. And I'm not.
Yeah. There definitely are people who are
talking
on
about
that
making a judgment about it. I'm talking about just.
There are definitely people who are on that spectrum. There are some people who specifically want to say that, want to target undocumented illegal immigration. And there are some people, like Yvonne says, who have a feeling that we need to curb immigration in all forms.
So just say we need to curb illegal and legal immigration.
Right.
In that case. That's all.
I think to me, immigration would, I had thought that immigration would cover that because you're talking about all forms of immigration. When you're specifically talking about undocumented immigration, you would say that. But I mean, this is a place where you do want to be very clear in your terms, and we do try very hard to do that, but this is an evolving area, and we might not get it right every time, but we try to be very careful about exactly that.
So it
maybe
sounds
we can
like
do
your
better.
Answer is yes, and you're already doing what I.
We're trying, you know, we're certainly open when you're reading Monitor articles. If you're seeing that not represented, or you have a question, to reach out to us, and we can either explain how we're doing it, or maybe there's something we can improve. But I do think that's an important point: is you need to convey someone's position accurately and not be general about it. And as Yvonne said, we're deadline. Sometimes we might not get it right in every case, but we're trying. That is absolutely something that I think you're right. It's important to make sure that you're being specific.
And as Yvonne would say, talk to the editor. Yes, last one here.
I'll try to be brief. When picking a president, Americans tend to forget that somehow history has put the burden on this nation. And just like Scott said, like, whoever's leading America, that somehow affects the rest of the world. I'm Nigerian, and somehow Trump becoming president has affected Nigerians, because you can see a huge split between conservative Christians, liberal Christians in Nigeria. You can see the split between conservative Muslims and liberal Muslims in Nigeria. And I'm just wondering, like, do you think that this is an unfair burden to put on one country, or to put on the burden on the voters in this country? And do you think that, given what has happened in the past few years and how America has somehow pulled out of, like, things that somehow history has put on it, like the climate accord in Paris and like other responsibilities the country has, do you think that the world should stop looking to America for this kind of unfair, some might say, or uneven leadership?
Do you want to start with that, Scott?
Sure. No, I think, I mean, we're witnessing an American influence that is in transition at the moment, and it is not as powerful or as looked to as benevolently or as sympathetically or as inspiringly as it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, even 20 years ago, depending on the types of institutions and the type of structures you're talking about. I mean, there are so many layers of gray on this, and it depends on what metric you use. I mean, can the United States exact the kind of outcomes that it wants in a country like Syria, which 15 years ago wouldn't have been any question. Of course, the United States says this, then this might happen. Or, you know, it had a lot more of that kind of concrete influence. Today, it can't even, you know, help choose which prime minister is going to lead Iraq, which is in total chaos. And the Iranians are actually the guys who are running that show in terms of who is going to be chosen. The Iranians are actually going to be the power brokers. So part of that is a deliberate shift. You know, the United States has turned around. I mean, you know, this is one of the results of the Iraq and the Afghan wars. President Obama tried to end those wars, or certainly, you know, contract our influence in them. This was, and this was exactly the point that those Syrian rebels that I was speaking to, you know, who said that they'd been betrayed by President Obama. Well, because there were all kinds of mixed messages coming, you know, from different people. But part of it, you remember, President Obama was going to, you know, pivot to Asia away from the Middle East for the first time. You know, President Trump has killed this Iranian general, risking potential war with Iran, and yet this is the president who says we're going to pull out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and actually we're going to do so really precipitously if we want to. So I think a lot of the things that have been pillars in for so many years are shifting quite dramatically, and it's not just this president. These things have been happening, you know, and for a whole host of reasons. So nevertheless, people do still look abroad, and I hear this too. And one of the reasons why people ask this question about President Trump, they're just like, how could you Americans have let that happen? You know, one of the reasons why they're asking that question is because for so many decades, they looked for inspiration of various kinds to the American example, you know, the American model. And I remember reading, there's a huge history of the American people by a British historian called Paul Johnson. And in his introduction, he says, you know, this America is like the most important human experiment in history because it's bringing together people from all around the world to try and live together. And if that is successful, this is going to be a miracle. And if it isn't, and many today would argue that we're on the back side of that, not on the front side of it, then, then that's also a different outcome. And so, but all these things are at play at the moment. And I think, what I find when people ask this question about like what is happening with American politics is they wanted something to look up to, I mean, in the same way that Trump is unpopular in many, many places around the world, just because people, like you said, you mentioned the uncertainty of the decisions about like now we're no longer going to embrace these global issues because it's America first and all of that at the expense of everybody else is how it's read outside. People also looked up to President Obama, who made amazing speeches, spoke in global terms, tried to do this and that. So that's how outside, this is the sentiment that you often hear, but I think much more strategically is that people who themselves in so many places, and we see this during the Arab Spring 1, during now this most recently Arab Spring 2, they themselves are feeling a much greater degree of uncertainty in their own countries, where they are protesting against poor government and mismanagement and corruption, all that kind of stuff. And they are looking for an example that works, and they're not finding one today. So that's not a short answer, but I apologize.
Other last word, because we're after 9. There are refreshments out in Leonard Hall. Before we thank, I do have one more announcement. I missed one. For those that are on campus tomorrow, the EMC time, which is 11 to 12, and it's going to be in Perry Lounge, and the speaker will be Mark Sappenfield. So you haven't finished with him yet. Would you join me in thanking Yvonne, Scott, Story, and Mark?